It was Paul, the apostle of Jesus the Christ, when speaking to the church at Corinth, who declared forthrightly according to 2 Corinthians chapter number 6, starting with verse number 14, Paul says, and I quote, "Be not unequally yoked." Over the years, it has often been discussed, debated, and dialogued as to what it is that Paul really meant by this statement. Did he simply mean that believers are not to marry unbelievers, or is it deeper than this? I submit to all of us this morning that it's not either or, but rather it is both and. When it is that Paul says, "Be not unequally yoked," he's speaking to new believers in the city of Corinth who are trying to live holy in an unholy city. And the first thing that he says to all of these new believers who are trying to live holy in an unholy city is that when you get married, don't get married to people who don't believe in your Christ. Because in the event that you marry people who do not believe in your Christ, ladies and gentlemen, they'll turn you away from God before you have the opportunity to turn their hearts towards God. At the same time, he's saying to these believers in the city of Corinth who are trying to live holy in an unholy nation, he says this statement does not just pertain to marriage, but it pertains to any relationship that would cause you to compromise your faith in Jesus. It pertains to any relationship that would cause you to water down your faith in Jesus. It is not just in marriage, but it is also in business. It is not just in business, but it is also in the school place. It is not just in the school place, but wherever you go, he's saying do not yoke up with people who do not believe in your God. Because if you attach yourself to people or allow people to attach themselves to you and they do not believe what it is that you believe, they will turn you away from God before you have the opportunity to turn them towards God. That really doesn't mean much to you until you come to the understanding this morning that a yoke is a wooden crosspiece that is attached to the necks of two animals that is attached to the load that they carry together. I'm going to say that again. A yoke is a wooden crosspiece that is attached to the necks of two animals that is attached to the load that they carry together. The question has to be raised, what happens when two animals of unequal strength are attached to one yoke and attached to one load at the same time? Whenever you have two animals of unequal strength, that says that one animal is stronger than the other animal. And because one animal is stronger than the other animal, the only reason you put them under a yoke is that they might be able to carry the load at that particular moment in time. But when one animal is stronger than the other animal, he pulls more than the other animal. In other words, he pulls not just the load, but he also pulls the other animal that's supposed to be helping him carry the load all at the same time. And because one animal is stronger than the other animal, when they pull the load, it is not a straight pull, but they pull the load in a curved manner. And because they pull the load in a curved manner, they end up traveling around in circles. The second question that many of us have to answer is what happens when you have two animals of equal strength, yet they have different mindsets trying to carry one load. Whenever you have two animals of equal strength, yet they have different mindsets trying to carry one load, the result, ladies and gentlemen, is not that they travel in circles, but the result is stagnation. What happens when you and I have the same strength and we yoke up together in order to carry a load, but you're pulling in one direction and I'm pulling in the opposite direction? And so therefore, as a consequence, in spite of us being equally strong, we get nothing accomplished because you have the same strength as I have. You go this way, I go the opposite direction, and the end result is stagnation. I want to pause to say to all of us, there are two consequences to being unequally yoked. Whether it be you are unequally yoked in marriage, whether it be you are unequally yoked in business, the first consequence to being unequally yoked is that you travel around in circles. The second consequence to being unequally yoked is that you are stagnant when you should be moving. That really doesn't mean much to you until you come to the understanding that life is a load itself. Does anybody in here under the sound of my voice voice believe this morning that life can be a load sometimes? You look good on the outside, but in spite of you looking good on the outside, many of us can attest to the reality, I look better than what it is that I'm carrying right now. I don't look like it, but I'm carrying an emotional load. I don't look like it, but I'm carrying a financial load. I don't look like it, but I'm carrying a mental load. I don't look like it, but I'm carrying a spiritual load. Does anybody in here believe that sometimes life in itself can be a load? And because life in itself can be a load, if I want to travel around in circles, I can do it by myself. I don't need no help to do that. Because life itself can be a load. If I want to be stagnant and have nothing to show for my work and all of my efforts, I can do that all by myself. I don't need anybody else to do that. But can anybody attest to the reality that when God allows somebody to attach themselves to you and God allows you to attach yourself to somebody, Lord, I need you to send me somebody who's going to help me carry the load. I need you to send me somebody who's not going to be pulling in one direction when I'm pulling in the opposite direction. I need you to send me somebody who I don't have to carry my load and them all at the same time. But life can be so heavy sometimes that I'm not able to make it by myself. What happens when you don't just need God, but you need God and you need somebody in order to help you carry that load? Such is the case with this young man by the name of Timothy. In Acts chapter number 16, beginning with verse number 1, we are introduced to Paul's protege in the faith by the name of Timothy. What amazes me is not that Timothy is the pastor in the city of Ephesus. He's a pastor in the city of Ephesus who feels like giving up. He feels like throwing in the towel because of the opposition that he's experiencing at this particular moment in time. The question has to be raised, why is he experiencing opposition? He's experiencing opposition, number one, because of his generation. Everybody shout, his generation. Why do you think that Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter number 4, starting with verse number 12, let no man despise thy youth? In other words, I understand that you were young and people are going to frown upon you and look down upon you because you were young, but in spite of your generation, keep right on doing what the Lord has called you to do. They oppose him not just because of his generation, but they oppose him because of the information that he's given the children at this particular moment in time. What information is this that really doesn't mean much to you until you come to the understanding that Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter number 1 verse 3, I left you in Ephesus to correct false teaching. I left you in Ephesus to correct false doctrine. Nobody wants to be corrected. And so therefore, as a consequence, because Timothy is the vessel that God uses in order to bring correction, they oppose him, number one, because he's young. You younger than me, you can't tell me nothing. They oppose him, number two, because of the information that he gives about correcting the teaching. What amazes me is not that he's the pastor in the city of Ephesus, but what amazes me is that his parents are unequally yoked. Somebody shout, they are unequally yoked. The Bible declares in Acts chapter number 16, starting with verse number 1, that his mother is a Jew who believes. At the same time, his father is a Greek. It almost puts emphasis in Acts chapter number 16, verse number 1, that his mother is a believer in Jesus, yet his father does not believe in Jesus. He grows up inside of a home where his mama goes to church, but his father does not go to church, yet he finds himself as a pastor. He grows up inside of a house where his mother loves God with all of her heart, with all of her soul, with all of her mind, and with all of her spirit. But while his mother loves God, his daddy tolerates God. But yet he finds himself as a pastor. The question has to be raised, how in the world can you grow up inside of a home where your parents are unequally yoked, so much to the point you go to church on Sunday morning with your mother, but while you are at church on Sunday morning with your mother, your daddy is watching the NBA playoffs. While you're at church on Sunday morning with your mother, your daddy is reading the newspaper at home. And the question has to be raised that if you have two parents who are headed in opposite directions, then how in the world did you turn out to be a pastor? His father is a Greek, but the Bible declares in Acts chapter number 16, starting with verse number 1, that his mother is a believing Jew, which says to all of us, in circumstances that are not ideal, a mother's faith is powerful enough to prevail. I'm going to say that again. In circumstances that are not ideal, a mother's faith is powerful enough to prevail. Does anybody believe that there is power in the faith of a mother? Does anybody believe that because of your mother's faith, you are who you are at this particular moment in time? I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I am who I am in 2017, not because of my education, not because of my downtown connections, not because I've always said the right things, not because I've always done the right things, not because I've crossed every T, and not because I've dotted every I, but I am who I am because I had a believing mother. And sometimes as a young child, you don't like the reality that your mother has faith. Can you imagine how Timothy felt as a young child? Can you imagine that every Sunday when his mother drug him to church? Timothy is just like many of us. He passed the drug test as a young child. His mama drugged him to church. Mama, this don't make sense. You dragging me to church and daddy ain't going to church. Why can't I stay at the house with my father? Can you imagine as a young child, he does not like the fact that his mother has faith so much to the point that she drags him to church. But what he did not like as a young child, he appreciates as an adult. And there's somebody in here under the sound of my voice who can attest to the reality. I didn't like the fact as a young child that my mama drugged me to church. Monday night was Bible study. Tuesday night was choir rehearsal. Wednesday night was midweek worship. Thursday night was life recovery. Friday night was youth activity night. Saturday morning, when all of my other friends had the privilege and the honor of laying inside of the bed, she drugged me to the neighborhood around the church to be a witness in East Lake, Brown Springs, and Gate City. And then Sunday came, and when Sunday came, as if I had not been inside of the church all week long, she ain't just dragged me to church, she drugged me to a thing called Sunday school. Somebody in here know my mama, because your mama was just like my mama. But what you did not appreciate as a young child, you've learned how to tell God thank you as an adult. And is there anybody in here under the sound of my voice who can take about 30 to 45 seconds and thank God for the faith that is inside of your mother? Thank God that you had a mother who believed. Thank God that you had a mother who had faith. Thank God that you had a mother who knew how to pray. She might not have had much, but mama had a thing called faith. Somebody shout faith. Such is the case in 2 Timothy chapter number 1, verse 5. Paul is writing this pastoral epistle from prison. The question has to be raised, why is the preacher in prison? The preacher is not in prison because he cheated on his taxes. The preacher is not in prison because he touched somebody that he was not supposed to touch. The preacher is not in prison for the conventional ways that many of us in 2017 as preachers of the gospel go to prison. He's in prison for preaching the glorious gospel of Jesus the Christ, which says sometimes I'm in trouble not because I've done something wrong, but sometimes I'm in trouble because I've decided to do something right. Somebody just missed it. I'm going to say it again. Sometimes I experience opposition, not because I've done wrong, but sometimes I experience opposition because I've decided to do something right. And while he is in prison, he is writing to encourage his spiritual son in the faith. He says to young Timothy, I know you feel like giving up because I left you in Ephesus to bring correction to the false teaching. People oppose you, number one, because of your generation. They say that you were too young. They oppose you, number two, because of the information that you give them. Nobody wants to be told that they are wrong, but I want to encourage you not to give up. And here's the reason. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is inside of you. He says, when I bring to my remembrance the sincere faith that is inside of you. The only reason you can stand when you feel like quitting in the middle of your opposition is not because of your bank account. The only reason you can stand when you feel like quitting in the middle of your opposition is not because of the car you drive. The only reason you can stand in the middle of your opposition is not because of the money you have, not because of your car, not because of your clothes, not because of your house. It's because of your faith. Somebody shout faith. He says, when I call to remembrance the sincere faith that is inside of you, I want you to know that faith did not start with you. It started with your grandmama by the name of Lois. That's a grandmama name right there. Somebody shout Lois. He says, your grandmama had faith first. And after your grandmama had faith, she passed it down to your mama. Grandmama named Lois, your mama's name is Eunice. Lois in the Greek means agreeable. Eunice in the Greek means good victory. He says, your grandmama had it. She wasn't stingy to keep it to herself. Every time she tried to keep it to herself, she said I wasn't going to tell nobody, but I just couldn't keep it to myself. So she passed it down to mama, and then your mama had sense enough to pass it on down to you, which says to all of us, ladies and gentlemen, that the greatest gift that a mother can give to her child is not material, but the greatest gift that a mother can give to her child is her faith. I'm going to say that again. The greatest gift that a mother can give to her child is not material, but the greatest gift that a mother can give to her child is her faith. Whenever you experience opposition as an adult, it is not your material blessings that's going to cause you to stand. It's your faith that's going to cause you to stand. When you experience opposition as an adult, it is not how you drive, how you dress, and where you live that's going to cause you to stand. It's your faith that's going to cause you to stand. Every time you feel like quitting, your faith is going to remind you, be not weary in well-doing, but in due season you'll reap if you faint not. Every time you feel like quitting, your faith is going to remind you, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings as eagles, run and not grow weary. They shall walk and they shall not faint. Is there anybody in here who can thank God not for a house, not for a car, not for money? I dare you to thank God that you got faith. Somebody shout, I'm standing because of my faith. Is there anybody in here who can attest to the reality that I've come this far by faith? Leaning and depending on the Lord. God has not just brought me a mighty long way. He's brought me all of the way. And the reason he's brought me all of the way is because of a thing called faith. Somebody shout faith. The greatest gift that a mother can give to her child is her faith. That really does not mean much to you until you come to the understanding that Timothy's name literally means honoring God. Somebody shout, honoring God. Somebody say it again, honoring God. He finds himself in a precarious predicament because he's a pastor experiencing opposition from the parishioners. And the opposition is so bad that he feels like quitting. It's so bad that he feels like throwing in the towel. And when he feels like quitting and feels like throwing in the towel, Paul writes to Timothy in order to tell him, you better not quit and you better not give up. And the reason you are not going to quit is because of the faith that's inside of you. And the way you got this faith is because of your mother. That really doesn't mean much to you until you come to the understanding his name means honoring God. Which says to all of us, ladies and gentlemen, the goal of the mother who passes her faith to her child is to produce a child that honors God. I know that's simple, but that's all I got for you this morning. I'm going to say it again. The goal of a mother that passes her faith to her child is to produce a child that honors God. I want to produce children who love God, not when they get 50 years old. I want to produce children who love God even right now. I want to produce children who chase after God, not when they get 60 and 70. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you come to God before you take your last breath. But I want to produce some children who can chase after God right now. I want to produce children who learn how to praise God, not when they get 70 years old. I want to produce some children who know that praising God is cool right now. I want to produce some children who learn how to open up their mouth, not when they become older. I want to produce some children who don't mind having a fire for God and a passion for God so much to the point that they're able to open up their mouth right now. The goal of a mother who passes her faith to her child is to produce a child who honors God. So the question has to be raised this morning, how is it that mothers can cause children to honor God? Number one, if children are going to honor God, children honor God when they fearlessly fulfill their God-given purpose. I need everybody to shout that with me into the whole east side. Here's you. Everybody shout, children honor God when they fearlessly fulfill their God-given purpose. At this particular moment in time, Timothy, this young protege in the faith who pastors this mega church in the city of Ephesus, he's absolutely afraid. But while he's afraid, Paul writes to him and says, when I bring to remembrance the sincere faith that is inside of you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois, then in your mother Eunice, and now I'm persuaded that is in thee also, he says, I admonish you and encourage you and challenge you, stir up the gift of the Holy Spirit that is inside of you. And then he says in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, God has not given you the spirit of fear. He's telling Timothy, stand in the middle of opposition against all fear. In spite of your fear, you got to have some courage. Somebody shout courage. What is courage? Courage is not the absence of fear. It's obedience to God in the presence of fear. I know you're afraid right now because you don't know how this situation is going to turn out. I know you're afraid right now because those who claim to love God the same way that you love God are in opposition to you at this particular moment in time. But I want to encourage you that even though you feel fear, God did not give you that spirit. But instead of you having a spirit of fear, he says you got the opposite spirit of fear, which happens to be faith. Does anybody know what faith is? The Bible declares in Hebrews 11 verse number 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the evidence of things not seen. The Bible declares in Hebrews chapter number 11, verse number 6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Which means that the goal of my faith is not to get God to please me with cars, clothes, and money, but the goal of my faith is to please God in any and every circumstance that I find myself in, that my circumstance does not make me back away from God, but it leads me to draw closer to God. The Bible declares in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, let us hold fast to the profession of our faith without wavering, because God who promised is faithful. Somebody shout, God is faithful. Children honor God when they fearlessly fulfill their purpose in spite of opposition. This is the reason that Paul writes to Timothy and he says, I know that you are afraid because of what you have to stand up against. I know you're afraid because of the load that you carry, but God has not given you the spirit of fear. Number 2, children honor God by walking in their God-given ability and loving unconditionally in spite of opposition. Everybody shout that with me. Children honor God by walking in their God-given ability and loving unconditionally in spite of opposition. Somebody say it again, in spite of opposition. He says, I know that you're dealing with some people who oppose you, but God has not given you the spirit of fear. Fulfill your God-given purpose fearlessly, he says then, but of power. Somebody shout power. The word power in the Greek is the word dunamis, which is where we get our English word dynamite from. It is translated as ability. I want you to know that even though it's hard, God has placed inside of you a unique ability to get through this. Even though you are suffering, God has placed inside of you a unique ability to get through this. Even though you are crying, God has placed inside of you a unique ability to get through this. Even though you feel like quitting, even though you feel like throwing in the towel, God has placed inside of you a unique ability, a unique gift in order for you to make it through your situation at this particular moment in time. Maybe your situation is not the situation of Timothy, but many of us in here under the sound of my voice can attest to the reality, I got my own load. My load might not be the load of Timothy, but I know what it is to carry your load and feel like quitting. I know what it is to carry your load and feel like throwing in the towel. And just when you feel like quitting and throwing in the towel, God's reminding you that because of the faith of your mother, I placed inside of you a unique ability, a unique gift in order to carry the load that you are carrying at this particular moment in time. At your first gift, at your first birth, you get natural gifts. At your second birth, you get supernatural gifts. And when you couple your natural gifts with your supernatural gifts that you get when you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, he says you got everything that you need in order to make it through the load that you're carrying at this particular moment in time. Children honor God by walking in their God-given ability and loving unconditionally in spite of opposition. Can you imagine, because of the opposition that Timothy is facing, he don't feel like loving nobody? What happens when I'm saved, but I don't feel like walking in love? Y'all ain't never been there before. What happens when I'm saved, but these folk ain't just getting on my nerves, they getting on my last nerve? What happens when I'm saved and I feel like cussing? What happens when I'm saved and I feel like laying hands on somebody? And I ain't talking about holy hands, I'm talking about unholy hands. I ran across a t-shirt on Facebook the other day. It said, I'm saved, and it had some boxing gloves. It said, I'm saved, but you can catch these hands. Anybody ever felt like that before? Okay, y'all too stuck up to admit it. What happens when I'm in church, but I don't feel like walking in love? I'm lifting my hands in worship, but I don't feel like walking in love. I'm celebrating God and I'm praising God, but when I leave the sanctuary, there's a situation that's getting on my last nerve, and I don't feel like calling on the name of Jesus. Paul says to Timothy, who finds himself in this situation because of the faith of your mother that dwelt first in your grandmother that is now inside of you. He says, God has not given you the spirit of fear. Fulfill your purpose fearlessly, but of power. Watch this. You got the ability to make it through this, and of love. Somebody shout of love. That word for love is agape. It literally means unconditionally. They are opposing you, but don't treat them the same way that they treat you. Which says to all of us, number two, children honor God by walking in their God-given ability and loving unconditionally in spite of opposition. Let me get to the third point I'm getting ready to raise up. Number three, children honor God by thinking clearly before they act in spite of opposition. Everybody repeat after me. Children honor God by thinking clearly before they act in spite of opposition. Paul says to Timothy, they're opposing you, but don't move too quick. What he's really saying to Timothy is the words of the prophet by the name of Ice Cube, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Yeah, he says, Timothy, I know you feel it's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. But he's saying, don't move so quick. Don't move so fast. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. That's where Timothy is at this particular moment in time. Because what happens when it's not the world who makes you upset? What happens when it's church people who make you upset? Y'all ain't never been there before. Moses experienced the same thing when he was leading the children of Israel from Egypt to the promised land. But before he got to the promised land, it wasn't the world who pissed him off. It was the children of Israel, God's chosen people, who pissed him off. It pissed them off so bad they started to complain as if they had forgotten what God had did on their behalf in the past. And when they started to complain against Moses, God says, I want you to give them water, but this time I don't want you to strike the rock. I want you to speak to the rock. And because they upset him so bad, he doesn't speak to the rock, but he strikes the rock the same way that he did it the first time. And God says, I'm going to provide for my children, and they're going to make it into the promised land, but you won't see the promised land because you allowed somebody else to make you angry. Somebody just missed it. I'm going to say it again. He says, I'm going to provide for my children. They're going to experience the promise. You won't see it because you allowed them to get up under your skin. You won't see it because you allowed somebody else to make you angry. Isn't it amazing that Moses disobeys God, but God cares so much about his children, he provided for them in spite of the disobedience of the leader. He said, speak to the rock. Moses struck the rock. God still brought water out of the rock and says, I'm not going to punish the children of Israel for what they do to you. They don't know any better. That's why I made you the shepherd. He says, but instead I'm going to punish you. You are not going to make it into the promised land simply because you let somebody else make you mad. Timothy finds himself in that situation. People are making him mad. Not those in the world, those who are in the church. Paul says to Timothy, I know you feel like quitting, but God hadn't given you the spirit of fear. Pursue your call fearlessly, but of power. You got the ability to carry this load, and of love. Love them unconditionally. Don't treat them the same way that they treat you. But he also says, think clearly. Somebody shout, think clearly. He says he's given you the spirit of power and of love and a sound mind, which says to all of us, children, honor God by thinking clearly before they act in spite of opposition. So the question has to be raised, how is it that he's able to honor God in spite of his opposition? He thinks clearly. He has the ability to make it through it. He's not treating people the same way they treat him, but the only reason he's able to walk in this is not because of him, not because of his education, not because of his downtown connections, not because he's so good, not because he's so smart. He says the only reason you can do what I'm telling you to do, your mama put some faith inside of you. The only reason you can do what I'm telling you to do, your grandmother put the same faith in your mama. And your mama passed the faith down to you. And if you're going to carry the load that you're carrying, money can't carry this load. If you're going to carry the load that you're carrying, a car can't carry this load. If you're going to carry the load that you're carrying, he says clothes can't carry this load. If you're going to carry this load that you're carrying, he says your zip code, the side of town that you live in, can't carry this load. He says, but if you're going to carry this load, you got to have some faith. I want to encourage every mother in here under the sound of my voice. Perhaps you cannot provide all of the accoutrements of life to the child that God has given you to birth. But even if you can't provide material things, whatever you do, don't forget to hand down your faith. When you hand down your faith, your child can run from you when they get old. Anybody other than me ever said, when I get grown, I ain't never coming back to church this morning? Never. That drug test ain't no joke. I mean, dang, here we go. We in church again. And you know my granddaddy was a pastor. I ain't never told him this, but Lord, when she made me stay over at his house, oh, Lord. That means we going to be in church every night of the week. But what I hated then, I thank God for it now. And I want to say that to all of us. What you hated then, learn how to thank God for now. What am I thanking God for? A mother's faith. A mother's faith. A mother's faith. For everybody who's carrying a load right now, remember that faith. For everybody who feels like quitting, you got what it takes to make it. Everybody stand to your feet.